Welcome back to Crimson Threads, the channel where we unravel the darkest stories of human nature. What happens when the American dream sours into a nightmare? When the quiet hum of a suburban street is shattered by sirens and screams? Today, we're delving into a case that shook a community to its core. A story of love, betrayal, and a fire that consumed more than just houses. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most monstrous acts are committed by the people we least expect. But before we step into the heart of this darkness, if you're fascinated by true crime and complex investigations, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single thread of the stories we unravel here. Now, let's begin. The first call came in at 2:17 a.m. A frantic, choked voice screaming about fire. Not just a fire, but an inferno. By the time Detective Miles Corbin and his partner, Detective Isabella Rossi, arrived on the scene, Maple Creek Drive looked like a war zone. The quiet, suburban street, usually a picture of manicured lawns and sleeping families, was now a chaotic tableau of flashing red and blue lights, screaming sirens, and the hungry, roaring beast of a fire that was devouring everything in its path. 3 houses were fully engulfed, the flames leaping high into the pre-dawn sky, painting the undersides of the thick, billowing smoke clouds in a hellish orange glow. A 4th house was starting to catch, the vinyl siding melting and bubbling like heated plastic. Firefighters, silhouetted against the blaze, were engaged in a desperate, seemingly futile battle against the raging inferno. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning plastic, wood, and something else. Something vaguely metallic and deeply unsettling. "Looks like the gates of hell opened up for a block party," Corbin muttered, his voice a low rumble as he stepped out of their unmarked sedan. He was a man built for this kind of chaos, broad-shouldered and with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the sun too long. His eyes, however, were a startlingly clear blue, and they missed nothing. Rossi, younger and with a perpetually sharp, intelligent glint in her dark eyes, was already scanning the scene, her mind a whirlwind of activity. Dispatch said it started at 12:25 Maple Creek. "The middle one," she said, pointing to the epicenter of the blaze, a 2-story colonial that was now little more than a skeletal frame of charred wood. The fire spread to 12:23 and 12:27. "It looks like 12:21 is next on the menu." They made their way towards the command post, a makeshift hub of activity set up near the fire chief's truck. The heat from the fires was intense, a physical presence that pushed against their skin. The roar of the flames was a deafening, constant hum, punctuated by the sharp crackle of exploding windows and the groan of collapsing structures. Fire Chief Mike O'Halloran, a man whose face was a roadmap of soot and worry lines, met them with a grim expression. "Glad you're here, detectives," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting over the din. "This is a bad one, a real bad one." "What have we got, Mike?" Corbin asked, his gaze fixed on the burning houses. "Started in the middle house, 12:25. We got the call at 2:17. By the time my guys got here, it was already fully engulfed. The fire spread fast, real fast, too fast." He paused, his eyes meeting Corbin's. "We found something." "Something?" Rossi prompted, her notepad already in hand. "An accelerant. My guys could smell it as soon as they got close. Gasoline, maybe something else. We'll know for sure once we can get in there. But this was no accident. This was arson." Corbin and Rossi exchanged a look. Arson was bad enough, but an arson that targeted 3, potentially 4, homes in the middle of the night? This was something else entirely. This was an act of extreme violence, an act of rage. "Who lives at 12:25? Corbin asked. "The Hendersons. Mark and Sarah Henderson. Been here for about 10 years, according to the neighbors. Quiet couple, kept to themselves mostly." "Any sign of them?" O'Halloran shook his head, his expression grim. "Not yet. We haven't been able to get inside. The structure is too unstable. But we found a body on the lawn of 12:27. A cold knot tightened in Corbin's stomach. "The neighbor's lawn?" "Yeah, male. Badly burned. We think it might be Mark Henderson, but we can't be sure yet. My guys are trying to keep the flames off him, but it's tough." "And Sarah Henderson?" Rossi asked, her voice quiet. O'Halloran's silence was answer enough. She was likely still inside. The next few hours were a blur of controlled chaos. The firefighters, with a grim determination, managed to contain the blaze, preventing it from spreading any further down the street. But the 3 houses at the heart of the inferno were a total loss, their charred remains standing like blackened teeth against the slowly lightening sky. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, ethereal light over the scene of devastation, the true scope of the tragedy began to reveal itself. The body on the lawn of 1227 was indeed a man, his features almost completely obscured by the horrific burns that covered his body. The medical examiner, Dr. Evans, a woman with a morbidly cheerful disposition that always seemed out of place at crime scenes, was already on the scene, her team carefully documenting the position of the body before moving it. "He was alive when he was on fire," Dr. Evans said, pointing to the soot in the man's airways. "And from the looks of it, he had other injuries too. A gunshot wound to the head." Corbin's blood ran cold. A gunshot wound. This wasn't just arson. This was murder. The focus of the investigation now shifted to the smoldering ruins of 1225 Maple Creek Drive. The fire marshal, a grizzled veteran named Hank, confirmed what O'Halloran had suspected. The house had been doused in gasoline. The fire had been set with a clear and malicious intent. It took several more hours for the house to be deemed safe enough to enter. The interior was a scene of utter devastation. The fire had consumed almost everything, leaving behind a black, sodden mess of charred wood, melted plastic, and shattered glass. The smell of smoke and death hung heavy in the air. In what was once the master bedroom, they found her. Sarah Henderson, or what was left of her. She was lying on the floor next to the bed. Her body mercifully spared the worst of the flames, but the cause of death was immediately apparent. A single gunshot wound to the chest. Corbin stood in the doorway of the ruined bedroom, a deep, weary sadness settling over him. He had seen too many scenes like this in his 20 years on the force, but they never got any easier. A home, a sanctuary turned into a tomb. A life, full of hopes and dreams, extinguished in a moment of brutal violence. The initial theory was starting to take shape, a dark and all too familiar narrative. A domestic dispute that had escalated into a horrific act of violence. Mark Henderson kills his wife, then, in a fit of rage and despair, sets his house on fire, taking his own life in the process. The fires at the neighboring houses? A final, desperate act of destruction, a way to lash out at the world before leaving it. It was a neat and tidy theory, one that would close the case quickly. But for Corbin, it felt too easy, too clean. There were loose ends that nagged at him. Why burn the neighbors' houses? Why shoot himself on the neighbor's lawn? It didn't quite add up. As the day wore on, the full weight of the tragedy began to settle on the community of Maple Creek. The neighbors, huddled together in shock and disbelief, watched as their quiet, peaceful street was transformed into a major crime scene. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces a mixture of fear, sadness, and a morbid curiosity. Corbin and Rossi began the grim task of interviewing the neighbors, trying to piece together a picture of the Hendersons' lives. What they heard painted a conflicting and confusing portrait. To some, the Hendersons were the perfect couple, always holding hands, always smiling. To others, they were distant and reclusive, a couple who kept to themselves and rarely interacted with their neighbors. One neighbor, a woman named Carol, who lived across the street, told them that she had heard arguing coming from the Hendersons' house in the weeks leading up to the fire. Not just arguing, she said, her voice trembling. It was screaming. Real, angry screaming. Another neighbor, a man named Tom, who lived next door at 1223, the first house to catch fire, said that he had seen Mark Henderson in his yard in the middle of the night, just hours before the fire started. He was just standing there, staring at his house, Tom said. It was strange. He looked lost, As the sun began to set on the longest day in the history of Maple Creek Drive, Corbin and Rossi found themselves with more questions than answers. The case, which had at first seemed so straightforward, was now shrouded in a thick fog of uncertainty. The fire had not just destroyed 3 homes. It had exposed the dark, hidden secrets that lay beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect suburban life. And as the last of the embers died out, Corbin knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult investigation. The inferno on Maple Creek Drive was not just a tragedy. It was a puzzle, a complex and disturbing puzzle that he and Rossi were now tasked with solving. And somewhere, in the ashes of those 3 burned-out houses, lay the truth. The days that followed the fire were a slow, meticulous process of sifting through the debris, both literal and metaphorical. The crime scene at Maple Creek Drive was a sprawling, complex puzzle, and Corbin and Rossi, along with a team of forensic experts, were tasked with finding the pieces that would tell the story of what had happened in the pre-dawn hours of that terrible morning. The autopsies of Mark and Sarah Henderson confirmed the initial findings. Sarah had been shot once in the chest with a .38 caliber handgun. The bullet had pierced her heart, killing her almost instantly. Mark had a single gunshot wound to the head, also from a .38. The gun was found near his body on the lawn of 1227, its serial number filed off. The burns he had sustained were post-mortem, though the smoke inhalation indicated he had been alive for a short time after the fire started. The official cause of death was ruled a suicide. The forensics team, led by a meticulous and no-nonsense woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, was able to confirm the presence of gasoline throughout the Hendersons' house, as well as on the exterior walls of the neighboring homes. The fire had been deliberately set, and it had been set to cause maximum damage. The initial theory of a murder-suicide seemed to be holding up. The evidence on the surface pointed to a clear and tragic narrative. Mark Henderson, in a fit of rage or despair, had killed his wife, set their world on fire, and then taken his own life. It was a story that the media, who had descended on Maple Creek Drive like a flock of vultures, were all too eager to report. The headlines screamed of a suburban tragedy, a love story gone wrong. But for Corbin, the pieces didn't quite fit. There was a dissonance to the narrative, a nagging feeling that something was missing. He kept coming back to the same questions. Why burn the neighbors' houses? It seemed like an act of pure, unadulterated malice, a level of rage that didn't quite square with the picture of the quiet, reserved Mark Henderson that the neighbors had painted. And why kill himself on the neighbor's lawn? It was a strange, almost theatrical final act. Rossi, ever the pragmatist, was more inclined to accept the murder-suicide theory. It's a classic case, Miles, she argued, as they sat in their cluttered office, the walls covered in crime scene photos and witness statements. The guy snaps, kills his wife, and then, in a final act of nihilism, decides to take the whole world down with him. We've seen it before. I know, Corbin conceded, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. But it just feels off. There's a piece of the puzzle we're not seeing. Their investigation turned to the lives of Mark and Sarah Henderson, to the secrets that lay buried beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage. They began by interviewing family and friends, and what they discovered only added to the complexity of the case. Sarah's sister, a woman named Jessica, painted a picture of a troubled marriage. Sarah was unhappy, she told them, her eyes red from crying. She had been for a while. Mark was controlling. He was jealous, possessive. He didn't like her having friends, didn't like her having a life outside of him. Jessica told them that Sarah had been talking about leaving Mark, that she had even been looking at apartments in the city. She was scared of him, Jessica said, her voice barely a whisper. She told me once that she thought he was capable of anything. Mark's brother, David, on the other hand, defended his brother fiercely. Mark loved Sarah, he insisted. He would never have hurt her. He was a good man, a quiet man. He was under a lot of stress, with his job and everything, but he would never have done something like this. The stress at his job was a new piece of information. Mark had been an accountant at a large firm in the city. Corbin and Rossi paid a visit to his office, where they spoke with his boss, a man named Mr. Thompson. Thompson confirmed that Mark had been under a great deal of pressure at work. The firm was undergoing a major audit, and Mark had been working long hours, often late into the night. He was a good employee, Thompson said, meticulous, reliable, but he was definitely feeling the strain. A search of Mark's work computer revealed something that sent a chill down Corbin's spine. In the weeks leading up to the fire, Mark had been making a series of large and increasingly desperate online searches. How to disappear, how to start a new life. Countries with no extradition treaty with the U.S. It was a detail that could be interpreted in two ways. Was he planning to run away with Sarah, to start a new life somewhere far away from the pressures of his job? Or was he planning to run away alone, after committing an unspeakable act of violence? The investigation took another turn when the forensics team came back with a surprising finding. They had found traces of a second accelerant at the scene, a highly flammable chemical that was not commonly available. It was a substance that would require a certain level of expertise to handle. This wasn't just some guy with a gas can, Dr. Sharma explained. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They wanted to make sure that fire burned hot and fast. This new piece of evidence threw a wrench in the murder-suicide theory. If Mark Henderson was a simple accountant, where would he have gotten his hands on a chemical like that? And why would he have used it? Corbin and Rossi went back to the neighbors, re-interviewing them, digging deeper, looking for any detail, no matter how small, that they might have missed. They spoke to Carol, the woman who had heard the arguing. She told them that in the weeks before the fire, she had seen a strange car parked on the street late at night, a dark-colored sedan with tinted windows. She had never seen it before, and she hadn't seen it since. They spoke to Tom, the man who had seen Mark in his yard. He added a new detail to his story. He said that when he saw Mark, he wasn't alone. There was someone with him, a man in a dark hooded sweatshirt. He couldn't see his face, but he remembered that the man was tall and slender. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they were forming was not the one they had expected. The presence of a second person, the use of a sophisticated accelerant, the strange car parked on the street. It all pointed to something more than a simple domestic dispute. Corbin was now convinced that they were not dealing with a murder-suicide. They were dealing with a double murder, a carefully planned and executed crime that had been designed to look like something else. Someone had killed Mark and Sarah Henderson, and then they had set the fire to cover their tracks. But who? And why? The answer, Corbin suspected, lay somewhere in the life that Mark Henderson had been so desperately trying to escape. The stress at his job, the audit at his firm, the online searches about disappearing. It all pointed to a man who was in over his head, a man who was involved in something dangerous. As the second week of the investigation drew to a close, Corbin and Rossi found themselves standing at a crossroads. The simple narrative of the murder-suicide was falling apart, and in its place was a far more complex and sinister story. They were no longer just investigating a family tragedy. They were investigating a conspiracy, a web of secrets and lies that had led to the deaths of two people and the destruction of an entire neighborhood. The whispers in the ashes were starting to tell a new story, a story of betrayal, greed, and murder. And as Corbin and Rossi followed the trail of those whispers, they knew that they were getting closer to the truth, a truth that was far more shocking and disturbing than they could have ever imagined. The fire on Maple Creek Drive had been just the beginning. The real inferno was still to come. The breakthrough in the case came from an unlikely source, a late-night talk show. Rossi was up late one night, unable to sleep, the images of the fire on Maple Creek Drive still haunting her thoughts, when she stumbled upon an interview with a financial journalist who was talking about a recent scandal that was rocking the corporate world. The scandal involved a massive accounting fraud at a large investment firm, a firm called Sterling and Finch. The name rang a bell. She pulled up the case file on her laptop and did a quick search. Sterling and Finch was the firm where Mark Henderson had worked. The journalist was talking about a whistleblower, an anonymous source who had leaked documents to the press, exposing the fraud. The documents detailed a complex scheme of money laundering and embezzlement that involved some of the firm's top executives. The journalist mentioned that the whistleblower was now in hiding, fearing for his life. A cold realization washed over Rossi. She picked up the phone and called Corbin. "I think I know what this is all about," she said, her voice filled with a newfound urgency. The next morning, they were back at Sterling and Finch, this time with a search warrant. They went straight to Mark Henderson's office, and with the help of a forensic accountant, they began to go through his files. It didn't take them long to find what they were looking for. Buried deep within a folder labeled Personal, they found a series of encrypted files. The forensic accountant was able to decrypt them, and what they found was a treasure trove of evidence. The files contained detailed records of the fraudulent activities at Sterling and Finch, the same documents that had been leaked to the press. Mark Henderson was the whistleblower. The pieces of the puzzle now fell into place with a terrifying clarity. Mark had discovered the fraud at his firm and had decided to expose it. He had been gathering evidence for months, planning to go to the authorities. But someone had found out. Someone with a lot to lose. The online searches for how to disappear were not about him planning to run away from his life. They were about him trying to protect himself and his wife. The stress, the long hours, the arguments with Sarah. It was all a result of the immense pressure he was under. He was a man living in fear, a man who knew that his life was in danger. The man in the hooded sweatshirt that Tom, the neighbor, had seen in the yard with Mark? He was not a friend, he was a threat. The strange car parked on the street, it was a surveillance vehicle watching Mark's every move. The fire, the murders. It was all a desperate and brutal attempt to silence him, to destroy the evidence and to send a chilling message to anyone else who might be thinking of talking. The murder-suicide had been a carefully crafted illusion, a way to throw the police off the scent. Corbin and Rossi now had a new set of suspects. The top executives at Sterling and Finch, the men who had the most to lose from Mark's whistleblowing. They focused their attention on the firm's CEO, a man named Jonathan Sterling, a charismatic and ruthless businessman with a reputation for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. They brought Sterling in for questioning, and he was as cool and composed as they had expected. He denied everything, of course. He claimed that he had never even met Mark Henderson, that he was just a low-level accountant at his firm. But Corbin and Rossi could see the fear in his eyes. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. The forensics team had been analyzing the debris from the fire, and they had found something that they had initially overlooked. It was a small, partially melted piece of a cell phone. They were able to recover some of the data from the phone's SIM card, and what they found was a series of text messages. The messages were from an unregistered burner phone, and they were sent to a man named Frank, a known enforcer for a local crime syndicate. The messages were a series of instructions, detailing the plan to silence Mark Henderson. The final message was sent just hours before the fire. It read, "Make it look like a domestic. No loose ends." The burner phone was traced to a location just a few blocks from Sterling and Finch's headquarters. And the man who had purchased the phone? Jonathan Sterling. With the text messages and the evidence from Mark's computer, they had enough to arrest Sterling. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, arson, and a host of other financial crimes. The story of the suburban tragedy on Maple Creek Drive was now a story of corporate greed and cold-blooded murder. The trial was a media sensation. The prosecution laid out the case against Sterling, painting a picture of a man who was so consumed by greed that he was willing to kill to protect his empire. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof that Sterling had ordered the murders. But the text messages, combined with the testimony of the forensic accountant and the evidence from Mark's computer, were too much to overcome. In the end, the jury found Jonathan Sterling guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His empire, built on a foundation of lies and deceit, came crashing down. The case of the fire on Maple Creek Drive was officially closed. But for Corbin and Rossi, the memory of that night would never fade. They had solved the case, they had brought a killer to justice, but they could not bring back the lives that had been lost. Maple Creek Drive slowly began to heal. The 3 burned-out houses were eventually torn down, and in their place, new homes were built. But the scars of that terrible night remained, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most peaceful of communities. For Corbin, The case was a stark reminder of the corrosive power of greed, of the lengths that some people will go to protect their secrets. And for Rossi, it was a lesson in the importance of looking beyond the obvious, of never accepting the easy answer. They had unraveled the crimson threads of a complex and tragic story, and in doing so, they had brought a small measure of justice to a world that often seems to have so little of it. But as they drove away from Maple Creek Drive for the last time, they knew that there would always be more stories to unravel, more secrets to uncover, more darkness to confront. And they would be there, ready to face it together.